This week, in the first of two programmes, he talks to choir masters and composers about the special characteristics of that distinctive sound.
Somehow, I always think of a dark, chilly evening, walking towards the great looming church. And as I get nearer, the echoes of music, of voices floating out from the building. Then I open the door, and with the warmth comes the full tide of that unmistakable sound. That's it, that very English cathedral choir sound, with the angelic purity of boys' voices crowning it. So how long have the boys been part of it all? David Flood, organist and master of the choristers at Canterbury Cathedral.
It starts from monastic times when boys were brought in as pupils in the monastery to learn the chant. And therefore, rather in the monastic flowing, kind of easy fashion, they were encouraged to sing in the same way. And here in Canterbury, we know that boys were singing right back in monastic times, well before the turn of the millennium, just after Augustine had been here. And I suppose that in learning from the monks themselves, they picked up the effortless way of singing. And then because of the English tradition of choir schools being almost without break, this sound has then come right through to us today.
So there's a huge weight of tradition. But what makes the sound itself so distinctive?
It's the way the sound has been trained and has become the natural sound, which is to use what we call the head voice rather than the chest voice. And this was highlighted just a few days ago when I saw a little German boy who came to sing to me and immediately went for a dark, gruff sound right down in the chest. But I was able, within about 10 minutes, to get an English sound from him, simply by letting him find that he had another octave above his voice, which he could just float into, a bit like one might call a falsetto. And that's the head voice that we use, which gives a light tone, but which enables them to sing high with great ease. The sound that we produce has grown in some ways out of the English polyphony of the kind of 16th, 17th century, which was the golden age of English music. To sing Bird and Gibbons, you really have to use the particular English quality which we've described in order to make it succeed. In other words, what I'm saying is that one doesn't necessarily have to use the sound that we have in this particular building. It's just that for the whole kind of corpus, i.e. the music itself, the liturgy, the building, the places in the building which we use for liturgy, this particular sound seems to suit it enormously well.
The sound I remember hearing on old records didn't seem nearly as bright and clear as that. Is it just a matter of recording technique, or has there been something of a rethink in the last few decades? Stephen Cleabury, Director of Music at the most famous institution of all, although it's not in fact a cathedral, King's College, Cambridge.
There's been quite a strong influence of the so-called continental sound of trebles singing, the history of which can quite easily be traced. For example, if you listen to recordings of King's Choir and even of Westminster Cathedral Choir made in the 20s and 30s, you'll find that what you hear is the so-called traditional English head voice, fluty, some say hooty sound. And if you listen today, you'll find that the majority of choirs produce a rather more open forward sound with a greater use of the so-called chest register.
This is how I remember that so-called hoot.
Oh, clap your hands together. Oh, clap your hands together. Oh, clap your hands together. Oh, clap your hands together.
Now compare that with this. The prime mover of that brighter, edgier, if you like, continental approach was George Malcolm at the Catholic Westminster Cathedral. He was something of a mentor to Stephen Cleobury. That second recording is the sound, gritty and strongly expressive, made by the present-day Westminster Choir under James O'Donnell.
Westminster Cathedral has, since the days of George Malcolm, been identified with the so-called continental technique, and I think in the 50s, when he was doing that, that was so unusual and so untypical of what was going on in English choirs that then the label made more sense than it does now, when I think people are discovering that what was meant by that was perhaps a slightly more adult singing technique for the boys, which creates a fuller, slightly better placed sound, perhaps a bit more focus to it, and more adult breathing technique. I think that also helps. And these things are the techniques which the boys pass on to each other here from generation to generation.
So perhaps in the end, these English and continental labels get in the way.
This has opened up a whole new territory, which is very exciting. It didn't catch on immediately, did it? I think it wasn't until that we all realised that the voice can be produced and developed in really very many ways. And so I think now there isn't really a typical English sound. At least there isn't in my ears.
That was Richard Seal, the man in charge of the music at Salisbury Cathedral. James O'Donnell points out another factor.
There's no doubt that, you know, the forthright style of this choir, which I've tried to continue, has something to do with the sheer volume of space that we have to fill.
Ah yes, those magnificent Norman and Gothic arched spaces. Surely they play a part in their choir's individual sounds.
I'm sure the influence of the building is terrific, and most of the time you're not aware of it. But working in there day after day, year after year, you realise that, in a sense, it's the best voice in the choir. And it's certainly the best stop on the organ. And I think we listen to the building more now than we used to. At least I find I'm doing that. And the acoustics do condition just how a piece can go. But having said that, what is so amazing here is that the acoustics change from day to day. One day you go in there and it's wonderfully bright, and perhaps there's a sort of frost outside, and everything is crystal clear, squeaky clean. Then you go in there another day and it's a bit like today, when things are a bit heavy. And it's hard work, and the building doesn't sing back to you in quite the same way.
Salisbury Choir and Cathedral singing with each other. King's College, Cambridge seems a much more intimate and architecturally unified space than the cathedrals. Somewhere the choir can sing in a hushed whisper and it'll carry to every last corner. But
I think here we are both very lucky and rather unlucky in that we have a 6-second reverberation period when the chapel is empty, and whereas this warmth of acoustic provides a great bloom for the sound, so to speak, or a cushion for the sound to sit on. At the same time, it can lead to slightly lazy habits of singing. Last week we gave a concert in the Royal Festival Hall in London, and one of the first things I do when we go into such a concert hall acoustic is to remind the choir that they've actually got to sing not only through every phrase, but right through every last note of every phrase, because there's no acoustic to help you.
Stephen Cleabury. So what music does suit the King's bathroom? Sir David Wilcox, Director of Music at King's for 15 years in the 60s and 70s, points out the problems of recording in such a space.
It's more difficult than some dry studios because you can always add reverberation if you're in a dry studio, but you can't eliminate reverberation if you're in a building like King's. King's, I think, was wonderful for singing Palestrina compared with the more polyphonic music of Bird. And there were problems of achieving clarity, I think, in King's, where with quickly flowing things like Handel's Dixit Dominus, it would be very difficult to make the runs very clear unless there's a degree of staccato to make sure the articulation of every note is there.
It's the unanimity of tone, of each syllable, that's so immaculate. How does a choir master go about achieving that all-important blend?
He will encourage the sort of sounds that he wants from the boys, and boys, being very good little mimics, will learn from each other a great deal. I used to vary the vowel sounds in which one practices because you have to sing every vowel, and I think that oo is a good vowel because you can't make a nasty noise singing oo. On the other hand, it can colour everything if you use it too much. R is an absolutely safe vowel to produce broad, round sounds, and E is very useful for brightening the tone. And I used to do several exercises, oo, o, r, a, e, gradually getting brighter throughout. But I think the daily exercises are very important for developing uniformity of sound.
Stephen Cleabury, rehearsing King's College Choir today, uses the same techniques.
Very beginning of verse 1, it should be a double E sound. E, do, E, do. We just hear that 1 and 2. E, do, good. Now the second verse comes to be very soft. Roll the We just hear that? Yes.
Most of the choirs, and there are 39 of them around the country, use men as altos, countertenors. But Westminster Cathedral uses an additional third set of boys, which adds even more bite to the treble sound. It's almost overpowering, particularly in the rehearsal room.
Some of you got nice relaxed yours, some of you are slightly pinching them. Okay, really properly do all these words. Okay, now the others. Say 2.
So does the Catholic choir in London produce a more continental sound? After all, they sing a lot of different repertoire from the Anglicans, Spanish and Portuguese settings of the Mass for a start. But then if we travel 300 miles north to Durham, this 11th century cathedral with its gigantic Norman pillars also requires a sound with edge. The Durham boys in their rehearsal room. Meanwhile, back in Salisbury Cathedral, how does the sound of that wonderfully plangent bit of Purcell fit in? Did you guess that those choristers were all girls? Salisbury was the first to introduce this new colour into the palette 4 years ago, but keeping its boys' choir as well, and others are following suit. But how best to go forward? Richard Seal.
Physically, of course, they are two different animals. The boy's voice reaches a lovely great bloom when, as you know, from 11, 12, round about that age when it's at its best, and then it starts to get a bit heavy, a bit cumbersome, a bit overweight, and not so easy to manipulate. And then last it changes, sometimes very quickly, sometimes imperceptibly, but ultimately it becomes a thing of the past. By comparison, age for age, a girl's voice is much more transparent, it's much lighter. But the extraordinary thing is that because of this lightness, I thought, is it just going to be enough for Stamford in C, Gloria, the big weighty stuff? And it could be that our acoustic we're just very, very lucky with, but it is enough.
I think that there are problems, of course, in cathedrals. Are you going to have your boys singing with the girls? Or are you going to have the girls on their own and the boys on their own? What I am sure about is that we mustn't let die the great 700-year-old tradition of boys and men choirs, because so much music was written for that particular medium.
David Wilcox. But what about blending boys' and girls' voices in one choir? Is that possible?
I would have said probably no if I hadn't heard the Toronto Children's Choir under Jean Ashworth Bartle, where she very successfully blends boys' and girls' voices. But there are practical difficulties in that a boy's voice is at its best probably between the age of 11 and 13, whereas girls go on getting better, I think, right through up to 17 or 18. So in the ideal children's choir, I suppose the boys might be 2 or 3 years younger than the girls, which poses educational problems.
I would fight tooth and nail to keep them apart, if for that very reason, that they are different creatures, they work better on their own, in their own individual ways, they make a different sound, and I think once the mixing starts, it would be very hard to unpick it. And so if you ask me what I hope will happen throughout the country, people will see that the girls have got something to offer on their own, just as the boys have for the last 700, 900 years. And it would be a great pity to start having an amalgam of sounds, an alloy. You haven't got the real sound of an all-male choir and the real sound of girls' voices on their own. It's different chemistry. Oh, I hope they will never, ever, ever, ever mix.
So although Richard Seal feels that they should never mix with the boys' voices, one thing is sure, the girls are here to stay and will become a part of the sound, just as the men are in every choir, underpinning the treble voices. And those diverse groups of the future will need new music. Music is being commissioned, and in great variety. James Lancelot, Master of the Choristers at Durham.
I've encouraged the Dean chapter to do this, and the first piece that they commissioned in my time here was for the 1300th anniversary of the death of St Cuthbert, a work by John Taverner, the icon of St Cuthbert of Lindisfarne, which I think has found a place in the repertoire, although it's obviously rather esoteric in its subject matter. John Taverner came up and immersed himself in the atmosphere of Durham and of Lindisfarne, and was obviously very taken with it, and it spoke to him and to his particular mystical outlook very deeply.
A lot of music down the centuries has been written for great church occasions. David Flood commissioned a grand Te Deum for the enthronement of the present Archbishop of Canterbury from a choirmaster colleague at Magdalen College, Oxford, Grayston Ives, himself a former chorister.
David Flood took me round the cathedral. We went round after dark, and we went up and he played the organ and showed me what, obviously the sorts of sounds that it could do, showed me where the choir would be, where the actual ceremony itself, the enthronement, would take place. To be in a building like that, just the two of you, what a fantastic place.
technically they are as near perfect in terms of intonation as you can get. So you can bear that in mind and use that quality, that sort of purity of sound which they can get. You tend to want to use mystical religious texts. Well, I do anyway. I feel that it's somehow right. And the third aspect is the actual acoustics, where a concert hall is usually fairly dry and the music is very transparent, and so you can write fairly complex music which you know people will hear. Whereas in a church, you tend to have to write much broader.
The composer Geoffrey Bergen, and you can hear what he means in his setting of the Nunc Dimittis. Undoubtedly, the best new works are those whose composers do take into account the particular acoustics and the particular qualities of the choir they're writing for. And how on earth 9-year-olds can achieve such near perfection is something for next week.
Geoffrey Bergen's setting of the Nunc Dimittis ends Choirs of Angels, and you can hear the second programme at the same time next week. The series is written and presented by Martin Handley and produced by Jenny Bild.
Time for Choirs of Angels. In the second of 2 programmes, Martin Handley visits choir schools to find out if the 700-year-old tradition of the English Cathedral choir is still alive and well in the 1990s.
Geoffrey Bergen's Nunc Dimittis. The 18 boys singing there in Canterbury Cathedral are between 8 and 13 years old. There are 39 choir schools in Britain, mostly Anglican and mostly in cathedral cities. Those schools actually have about 14,000 pupils, of whom just 860 are boy choristers and 70 are girl choristers. At almost all of the schools, choristers must board. During the winter term each year, choir masters and headmasters gather for voice trials when applicants are put through their paces. Is this just a case of pushy parents putting their little darlings forward? Whose idea was it?
My brother came here first. Then when he left, I was here for his last year. And, I was the one that wanted to come here.
Well, I'm very fond of music, and I'm an amateur singer myself, and hoped that one of my children would try for a choristership, and he was extremely keen, and we were all delighted when he was accepted.
We sort of found it out by chance. My mother was flicking through the Good Housekeeping, and suddenly she saw this article that was written by a boy who's still here about his experiences at choir school.
At my old school, we did have a choir and I was in it, and my music teacher had sent another boy to this school. We talked over it and I decided that I'd like to go and have a look. It looked quite inviting, so I decided to go for the voice trial. And the day after, I came home from school and I was telling my mum about my school day, and she just casually said, "Oh, by the way, Mr. O'Donnell phoned and you've got into Westminster Cathedral Choir School." And I kind of leapt for joy and ran around in the rain.
Someone who definitely knew what he wanted. Nowadays, it's made very clear to parents just what being a chorister, and indeed a chorister parent, entails. They're left in no doubt that it's only if their boy or girl wants to do it that it'll really work. As we shall see, the workload of a chorister is something that would make many an adult quail. So what is it that choir masters look for? David Flood of Canterbury.
Well, what I'm looking for is a complete package, really. I'm looking, first of all, for potential, not for achievement. At the age of 7, you really cannot test achievement. Order of priority, I'm looking for a brain, I'm looking for a very acute ear, then I'm looking for a voice, because if he's got 1 and 2, I can train number 3. It doesn't have to be a golden voice, but it needs to be the makings of a voice. And latterly, I'm asking for a bit of a sparkle in the personality, so that when the moment comes that something really has to be done, he's going to have that little bit extra, which is going to send a shiver down somebody's spine, and he's not going to hold back. That's the little bit extra. It's an indefinable little something, but it's an element of personality.
At Canterbury, there's an additional element in a chorister's day-to-day life, for although Choir House, where they all live, sits in the shadow of the east end of the cathedral, they don't go to school there, but to a mixed independent school some way away. Tim Pearce and his family live in Choir House and look after an extended family of 30 boys. He also teaches up at the school. So how is the chorister's day structured?
In a word, rigidly. It starts off with get up at about 7 o'clock in the morning, followed by breakfast for half the house at about 7:15 while the other half practice their instruments. All change over 20 minutes later, and then at just after 8 they will go over for their singing practice with David Flood, the organist, which will take them through till 9 o'clock. At 9 o'clock they then move on to minibuses which transport them the 1.5 miles to school at St Edmunds, just on the outskirts of Canterbury. They then have a relatively normal day, 9 till 4. The only difference being that they have to do their prep during part of the lunch break. Then they will return at 4:15 to Choir House, where cook will have some homemade cakes for them, a quick bit of refreshment, and then over to the cathedral for evensong practice beforehand, and returning to Choir House at about 6:15. Supper is then ready and eagerly devoured, and then they move on to another half an hour's instrumental practice, and from about 7:30 onwards the day's their own.
That is, if they've done all their prep. But if you happen not to be meant to be doing anything in particular at the end of a school day, what is there to do?
I have snooker tables. I bought them a football game last week. Obviously TV and videos. There is a computer in the house at the moment. We're hoping to increase that to include a CD-ROM. There are pianos, there are games. They're very into Games Workshop toys at the moment, which is painting lots of little models, which keeps them very busy and happy. We have an assembly hall where they play indoor football and basketball, and tennis courts as well.
Toby Ledbetter, choir tutor at King's College School, Cambridge. And if you're not being taken out by your parents for a couple of hours between services at the weekend, what do you get up to then?
On Saturday, we usually, after school, which finishes at 1 o'clock, we usually go out to town and get stacked up to the gills with sweets and whatnot. And then we have a video on the Saturday evening, and then we usually eat it all there and then just sick as a dog on Sunday morning.
So at last it's bedtime, when the new young choristers become more aware of just what they've let themselves in for, the fact that they're 7 years old and don't go home to sleep. The general view seems to be that choristers need to be boarders, regardless of how near they live to the school, partly to prevent the travelling giving them an even more tiring day, but also to help in melding the children into the team that they need to become. What do choristers think about the vexed subject?
I got homesick, but everyone around was helping and it was a very friendly atmosphere, so you soon get over it, although every time you come back you feel a bit homesick.
The good thing about boarding is that every single day you've got loads of friends to play with. At home, sometimes this isn't like that.
I think it's a good experience because you spend so much time with other boys and you make friends with so many people because, after all, you sleep in the same dormitory with them, you eat meals with them, and you sing with them, and you work with them in the classroom.
There's no doubt that some choristers do have a fairly torrid time of it, as Michael George, ex-King's chorister, now a professional singer, relates.
I was very homesick for about nearly 2 years. In fact, I tried to run away twice. And I once got to Cambridge Station and had no money to buy a ticket and had to give up. So I was in a fairly desperate state, really. I lived in Norfolk at the time and it seemed the other end of the world. They couldn't come and see me as often as some parents could, so I did feel rather abandoned.
Many parents have to swallow their doubts about what they're doing to their children, indeed are surprised when they discover that their child has to board, and find it hard to adjust.
We are losing because we miss him so much, and his brother and sister miss him very much. But we have to accept that Sebastian is gaining, ultimately, and we've got to think of him and less of ourselves. And we're all getting used to it, plus only being an hour away. My husband and I can be here so quickly that if he needed us, and certainly we come whenever he's singing or performing, which at the moment is only once a week.
When choristers arrive at school, they're mere probationers, who for a year or more are learning their trade. They often can't read music. So how does a choir master go about his task of turning them into mini-professionals in just 12 months, without being too boring about it and putting them off before they've even started? Stephen Cleabury of King's.
I think what I tend to do is to hedge my bets by operating on two fronts. I mean, there is the school of thought that says the best way is just to throw them in with all the others and let them copy it. So I do some of that. Equally, I mean, the other extreme would be to say that you mustn't mix them until they've learnt their trade and then they can go in and do it. So we also do have separate sessions for the probationers where we do rudiments and pitching and intervals and general musicianship training, I would say, oral training, and go through the mechanism of things like reading the psalms, how to fit the words to the chants and all this kind of thing. Because on that particular front, I strongly believe if you teach them the basics of that early on, they then don't find it difficult later on.
As with every other aspect of their lives, it's the older choristers who show the probationers how it's done, from processing with military precision into the cathedral for services to concentrating for longer periods of time than they'd have thought possible.
Now phrase. Breath. Look. Danger at the end of a phrase. Danger the breath meter gets low, the pitch goes down. They were astonished from there. Listen. Danger. Better. Concentrate, concentrate, concentrate. Just once again, lead us in, please, Can. Latter half of verse 4. They were astonished. Have a note? And lift. Danger. Fear is the word.
David Flood rehearsing at Canterbury. I've been struck by the disciplined attitude of the choristers everywhere to their work, particularly when rehearsing in the cathedrals themselves. Maybe Richard Seal at Salisbury has the explanation.
You walk into a lovely place and suddenly you're still, you're amazed, you're in awe. And I think the building actually cautions you, doesn't it? And you walk tall, and you're proud to be working in a place like this. Is there any other profession that you can think of where boys of 9 and girls of 9 are treated on exactly the same terms as a man of 55, a bass who's been here a million years? He's still capable of being flat, or sharp, or wrong, or late, just like little Jimmy down the end here. To have all this terrific variation of age, producing something creative, it's real magic.
It would be wrong to think that the work in the cathedral is all very serious. The best choir masters will ensure that there are always a lot of laughs, a lot of smiles. Does it all sound as if they're too angelic for words? Here's Simon Anderson, now a Durham lay clerk, that's the name given to the men in most choirs, and he was a chorister there as well.
The public's perception of a chorister is of a perfect, diligent child who's so well behaved, never steps out of line. And I'm afraid to say that it's complete nonsense, really. They're terrible people. They mess about, and I mean, obviously they behave when the surplice is on and stuff, but they're just like any other kids, really, and when the cassocks are off and they're in their jeans and jumpers.
Yes, choristers play as hard as they work. And just how hard that is, they discover when, after their time as probationers, singing perhaps one service a week, they suddenly find themselves in culture shock, singing 6 days a week, including 2 services on Sundays. The trouble is, a lot of choristers are good at a lot of things, particularly sport, which can lead to a spot of interdepartmental rivalry amongst the staff. Stephen Drew, headmaster at Durham.
At the moment, we've got 2 excellent athletes who are senior members of the choir. That makes life tough when we're trying to persuade the organist, who's a hard nut to crack, to let them play rugby football one day rather than go to evensong. They're principally here to sing, and very properly, I'm being politically correct here, very properly, he normally says he needs them in the cathedral, but just occasionally a tear springs to his normally merciless eye, and he says that they can play rugby football instead.
And of course, they contribute hugely to the musical life of the school outside the cathedral. Remember that in our 39 choir schools, only a small percentage are actually choristers. It must be difficult for non-choristers to understand what makes them do it. Do they get teased?
They think we're different sometimes, and we wear long dresses, sort of our choir robes. I think they get strange impressions. Yeah, they call them long dresses in our class. But
you don't mind that?
I don't mind that because I think that it's a great opportunity being a chorister.
I wonder what they think is the worst thing about being at school.
The part I don't like is probably having to get up early in the mornings.
I don't like languages very much.
Going out on wet days, going to play rugby.
I don't think I like the squash timetable really, because it is very pressurised, and I think it would be nice to get just a few minutes to linger about and do absolutely nothing.
And the best thing, starting with a junior probationer in his first term.
I think the best part is once we go to music lessons, once we get taught about music, not actually play any instruments. We just sit down in a room in the music school and we get taught some things. And I think we have games as well.
Staying here in the night because it's really spooky and I like spooky places.
I'd say the thing I like most would probably be singing the things I like most. Singing a Sunday Mass with a Mozart Mass. That's one of the things I enjoy most.
And the most enjoyable thing for parents? Well, it has to be listening to his or her first solo in evensong. Yes, the girls. Salisbury started their choir only 4 years ago, and by next year, half a dozen more will have followed suit. If I'd asked Richard Seale in the 80s about girl choristers, how would he have answered?
I'd have given you a most emphatic, can't ever see it happening. Because I think we've all been conditioned by what we grew up with. Having been a chorister myself, it was just a male domain, and my younger sister, who's arguably more musical than I am, and she had a lovely voice, I think she would have loved to have taken my place. But it never came into the equation. It was just one of these things, it wasn't done.
The times they are indeed a-changing. Kim Jones, senior lay clerk at Durham, makes an important point.
I think it's right that girls have an equal opportunity, but more than that, now that we have women priests, the fact that the choir sings in the place of the monks originally, it's right that we have girls who sing in the place of female priests.
Quite. The subject is still something of a hot potato, not least because it involves the need for money. It's amusing that a number of headmasters and choir masters around the country have daughters approaching chorister age, who are now busy asking their parents, why can't I be a chorister? Amy Carson, who was in at the beginning at Salisbury and is now head girl chorister.
When the girls first came here, there was a bit of rival, and the boys would say, well, we're much better than you, you're not very good. And we felt a bit put down by that. But now the girls and the boys don't mention about being better or worse. They just know that they're different.
There's one other important point to make. Choristers are privileged children, but what gives them that privilege is their talent, not their parents' background or ability to pay the school fees. Christopher Hellier, headmaster at Salisbury, speaks for his colleagues up and down the country.
I say regularly to all parents that the choristers provide what I call a socio-economic leavening of the school community as a whole. And we have a breadth of socio-economic background to this school which you wouldn't find in a typical preparatory school. And I'd go so far as to say probably the majority of choristers in this school would not be in independent education if they were not choristers. We try very hard to see that no child who has been selected on musical merit is excluded for financial reasons.
For the senior choir boys, an inescapable event is approaching, sometimes sooner than they'd wish. David Flood says their voices breaking is something they may really worry about.
Particularly when you start to get kind of gossiping between them. I mean, if somebody gets a bad throat or something, you can immediately hear someone say, do you think his voice is going? And almost kind of shock horror, you know. One doesn't want to kind of mention that kind of thing. But you do notice when somebody starts to have a problem or two, and that's the moment when you just quietly take them away and say, no, look, I'm aware of this. Don't worry about it. We'll help you achieve everything that you can achieve. You must tell me how you feel, and if you find yourself having too much trouble, then we'll call it a day. But you see, it's the moment when, through no fault of their own, the ability to achieve this great magical sound and be part of this great team is taken away from them, never to return. And it's a very distressing time for some of them, and you have to manage it very carefully, and the pastoral care has to be ultimate, really.
Hopefully, their voices will last the course. But then the final day, the final service comes.
It's called Sob Sunday because we always end on a Sunday, and it is emotional. I mean, my mother, she cried to see the others go, even though I wasn't leaving.
This is what one parent thinks being a chorister has done for her son.
He's much more organised, takes much greater responsibility for himself, is now showing, I think, in the choir and in his behaviour at school, in the boarding house. He takes some responsibility for the behaviour of the other choristers and the other boarders. So he's growing in all sorts of directions, which I don't feel he would have done if he hadn't been put in this environment. And indeed, if he'd had Mummy with him for the past couple of years, I don't think he would be as mature as he is now.
And after 5 years of singing day in, day out, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Be a rugby player.
I want to do something that revolves around music or art or drama.
I'd probably like to be a quantity surveyor, actually, or project manager. I would like to keep on at music, not professionally, but slightly more than a hobby.
I probably want to become a scientist of some kind and a part-time musician as well.
I would like to be a doctor, and I would like to keep going with the music as well, but maybe not professionally.
I have this dream of having my own tackle shop, fishing tackle, and alongside of that I could do my own holidays. Don't want to follow up with a musical career.
A fair amount of bet hedging going on. Choristers do, of course, go on to do all sorts of things, some far removed from music. Others will say that 5 years' steady percolation of daily music did influence them to take up some aspect of it as a profession. They seem to remember a defining moment that threw the switch, and that the independence, self-confidence and organising ability they learnt has been invaluable. Fine young voices don't often turn into fine mature ones. But even if they don't return as choral scholars or lay clerks, there are an awful lot of choir school masters who were choristers. No doubt one of their happiest memories will be of Christmas. No schoolwork, lots of outings, and playing tricks on Santa Claus. Whether or not he gets to sing the big solo, I suspect that John Preble will remember his Christmas for a long time.
I know we'll have all the same services as usual and the Santa traps, and on Christmas Eve we all go over to the old palace, we sing a Christmas carol, and then the Archbishop lets us in and we have a drink and some nibbles, and then we play Captains on Deck. What I like best about it is you get, in a sense, 2 Christmases. 2 family Christmases, really. You get the one at Choir House, and then you go home on Christmas Day at about 4:30 to 5 o'clock, and then you have your Christmas at home. And the music, I think, I love Christmas carols, and once you start singing Christmas carols, you just want to go on and on.
Clearly, if the choir school tradition is to survive well into the next millennium, its leaders will need to spend a lot of energy, as indeed they already do, selling its very special qualities. Certainly, it has its debits, but its credits seem by far to outweigh them. If new generations of parents can be persuaded of this, and the number of applications is as encouraging as it seems to be at the moment, a record year in some schools in 1995, then the future looks bright. Brighter than I'd imagined. And the advent of the girls has brought a promise of greater flexibility of groupings, each school coming to its own decision. And after all, most already admit girls as day pupils. Is Richard Seal confident about the future?
I think business is good. Business is burgeoning, really. It's an increasing industry. I feel that we're adding something here in Salisbury, as are indeed all these other places, which is very exciting.
Richard Shepherd's anthem, Ye Choirs of New Jerusalem, ends the last programme in the series, Choirs of Angels. It was written and presented by Martin Handley and produced by Jenny Bild.